I didn't plan to say anything. I had rehearsed staying quiet. I'd been staying quiet my whole life, so it shouldn't have been hard. But when my mother stood up at that table with her glass of wine raised and said, "My daughter Leanne is a surgeon. She saves lives," and then turned to me and said, "And this is my other one," I felt something shift. Not in a dramatic way, not the way it happens in movies where a person slams a door or throws a glass. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of something finally breaking that had been cracked for a very long time. My name is Phoebe. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a split-level house in Naperville, Illinois, with parents who never meant to be cruel, which is almost worse than parents who do. Cruelty with intention has edges you can grab onto. What they did was softer and more diffuse, like smoke filling a room so slowly you don't realize you can't breathe until you're already on the floor. My sister Leanne is 4 years older than me. She was always the one. You know the type, or maybe you were the other type, the one standing next to the one. Leanne got the grades without trying, the friends without effort, the attention without asking. She was genuinely talented, and I don't say that with bitterness. What I say with bitterness is that my parents took her talent as permission to stop looking for mine. When I was 9, I wrote a short story for a school contest. It was about a girl who finds a door in the back of her closet that leads to a version of her life where everything is different. I won 3rd place. I came home and showed my mother, who was on the phone. She held up one finger. "Wait," finished her conversation, looked at my ribbon, said, "Very nice, Phoebe," and handed it back to me. That same year, Leanne got an award for a science project, and my father put it in a frame. It's still on the wall of their living room. I checked the last time I was there. The nail is still in the same spot. This isn't a story about a ribbon. I'm not that fragile. But patterns are built from small things, and by the time I was 16, the pattern was clear. Leanne was the investment, and I was the overhead. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I'm not saying my parents didn't love me. They fed me, clothed me, showed up to most of my things. But there's a particular kind of invisibility that happens inside a family when one child becomes the story and the other becomes the background, and I was firmly, consistently background. When it came time for college, Leanne had a full tuition fund waiting. She went to Northwestern. She got the MCAT prep course, the prep books, the weekend trips to visit med schools. When I got into a state school in Indiana for their communications program, a good school, a school I was genuinely proud to get into. My father said, "That's a practical choice," in the same tone someone uses when they say, "It's fine" about a restaurant they hate. They helped with some tuition. Not what they'd given Leanne, but some. I took out the rest in loans and didn't complain because I was grateful and because I'd already learned that asking for equal footing in this family was not a request that would be heard. I graduated in 3.5 years. I moved to Chicago and got a job at a mid-size marketing agency. Entry level, $41,000 a year, a cubicle with a view of another cubicle. I was good at it. It turned out that years of being background had made me excellent at understanding what makes a story work, what makes someone lean in instead of tune out. I had a natural instinct for what people actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted. Within 4, I was leading a team. I was 26 when I got my first client that felt real, a regional healthcare nonprofit that wanted to rebrand before a major fundraising campaign. I built their entire strategy from scratch, ran the campaign, and helped them exceed their fundraising goal by 40%. My manager at the time told me I should think about going out on my own. I laughed it off. Then I thought about it for a year. Then I did it. I won't lie and say it was easy. The first 6 months of freelancing, I ate a lot of eggs and canned soup and spent a lot of Sunday nights staring at the ceiling wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But I had clients, and they referred other clients, and by the time I was 29, I had enough steady work to bring on a part-time contractor. By 30, I had 2 full-time employees in a small office in River North. My parents knew I worked in marketing. That was about the extent of it. I tried a few times to explain what I actually did, what the business was, that it was mine, that it was growing, My father would nod in the way that means he is not tracking any of this. My mother would say, "Oh, that's wonderful," and redirect to something about Leanne's hospital rotations. Leanne was finishing her residency at this point. She was brilliant at what she did, and she knew it. And she'd also inherited my parents' blind spot about me, though hers had a sharper edge. She wasn't dismissive the way they were. She was competitive, which is different, and in some ways worse, because it meant she was paying attention, just not in a way that wanted me to succeed. The incident that really clarified things for me happened about 2 years before the party. My mother had mentioned to Leanne that I was doing some kind of marketing thing. Leanne had a friend, a colleague actually, from the hospital, a guy who ran a concierge medical practice who needed a rebrand. My mother suggested me. I thought it was nice, honestly. I thought it was my mother doing something considerate. I reached out, sent a proposal, and we moved forward. The problem was that Leanne positioned herself as the connection the whole time. Her friend treated me like a favor he was doing her rather than a professional he'd hired. He was slow with approvals, changed direction twice without updating the scope, and then, when the project took longer than the original timeline because of his changes, he complained to Leanne. Leanne told him she understood, that she'd heard I had trouble with deadlines. She told him this without talking to me, without knowing the facts, without asking. I found out about it through a mutual acquaintance. I was furious, not just at the damage to the relationship, but at the casualness of it. She hadn't even thought about what she was doing. She just talked, the way she always had, in a family where her words had always been the ones that mattered. I didn't confront her. I'd thought about it for a long time and decided there was no version of that conversation that ended with her understanding why it was wrong. She would apologize in a way that made it my fault for being upset. I'd seen her do it before. So I let the client relationship end amicably, technically, and I kept working. I didn't tell my parents. Not because I wanted to protect Leanne, but because I already knew exactly what my mother would say. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. And my father would say nothing, which is his version of agreement. The party was my mother's 60th birthday. She'd wanted something elegant but casual, which is a sentence that means different things to everyone and nothing to anyone. But we had it at my aunt's house in Evanston because my aunt had a better dining room, and my mother had always slightly preferred my aunt's house to her own, a fact that I'm sure meant nothing and also probably meant everything. There were 14 people, both sides of the family, a few of my parents' close friends, Leanne and her boyfriend, and me. I had driven up from Chicago in the rain. I'd spent real time picking out what to wear, a deep green wrap dress I'd bought at a boutique in Wicker Park, a pair of earrings that had taken me 20 minutes to decide on. I'd stopped and bought flowers, a nice bottle of wine, a small framed print I knew my mother had admired in a shop window once. I wanted the evening to go well. I always wanted the evening to go well. I always wanted the evenings to go well. The wanting was exhausting. Dinner was fine. It was polite and warm in the way family dinners are when everyone is being careful. My aunt had made lasagna. There was bread and salad and a lot of catching up about people I barely knew. I sat near the end of the table and talked to my mother's college friend about Chicago neighborhoods and property values, which I know sounds boring, but was actually one of the better conversations I had all evening. The toasts happened after dessert. My father went first. He talked about my mother's warmth, her cooking, the way she'd kept the family together. It was sweet. My aunt cried a little. Then Leanne stood up. She talked for almost 5 minutes. She talked about growing up watching my mother work hard and sacrifice, about the example she'd set, about how proud she was to be her daughter. She made a joke about their matching stubbornness. Everyone laughed. She talked about how much the family meant to her and how lucky she was to be part of it. She looked at me once during this toast. Just once, briefly, like I was a piece of furniture she was acknowledging, so as not to seem rude. When she sat down, my mother was glowing. Actually glowing. And then she stood up herself, which surprised everyone, because usually the birthday person doesn't make a toast. She raised her glass, and she talked about being grateful. About her husband, about her friends, about the life she built, and then she said she wanted to acknowledge her daughters. She looked at Leanne and said, "I have a daughter who is a surgeon, who saves lives every day, who makes me proud every single time I hear her name." She paused for the room to respond. It did. There were smiles and nods and a small sound of collective appreciation. Then she turned to me. "And I have my Phoebe," she said. That was it. That was the whole sentence. And I have my Phoebe. No descriptor, no context, no role or accomplishment or even a gesture toward who I was or what I did. Just my name, appended to the real toast like a footnote. The room smiled politely. A few people looked at me with expressions I recognized immediately, that particular kind of social sympathy where someone witnesses something slightly awkward and isn't sure if they're allowed to notice. My aunt caught my eye for just a second and looked away. I smiled. I picked up my glass with everyone else. I said nothing. But here's what happened inside me in that moment. Something I'd spent years managing very carefully went completely still. Not silent the way it does when you're suppressing something. Still the way water goes still right before it freezes. I had spent 31 years waiting for a sentence. Not a long one. Just something with a verb in it. Something that acknowledged that I existed in a specific way, not just as a name, not just as the other one, but as a person with a history and a present and a life she built herself, for herself, from basically nothing and without help. I had been waiting for that sentence, and it had not come, and I realized, sitting there with that glass in my hand, that it was never going to come, not because they were malicious, because they genuinely didn't know. They had never thought to ask, and I had never thought to make them. And we had arrived at my mother's 60th birthday, with the two of us still in the same positions we'd always been. Her not seeing, me not insisting. I put my glass down. I didn't stand up dramatically. I didn't tap a fork on the glass. I just said from my seat, in a completely normal tone of voice, "Can I add something?" My mother looked at me a little surprised. "Of course, honey." I said, "I just wanted to introduce myself properly, since I don't think everyone at this table knows what I do." There was a small, confused laugh from somewhere. My father tilted his head. "My name is Phoebe," I said. "I'm 31. I own a marketing and brand strategy firm based in Chicago. I started it when I was 28 with about $4,000 in savings and one client. Right now I have a team of 5, and I'm currently in contract negotiations for the largest account I've ever had, which would more than double the size of my business." I paused. "I graduated early. I paid off my student loans 2 years ago. I've never missed a rent payment. I built the whole thing myself." I wasn't loud, I wasn't angry. My voice was the same voice I use in client presentations, which is even and clear and doesn't apologize for taking up space. The table was quiet. I looked at my mother and I said, "I'm really proud of what I've made. I just realized I've never actually told you that." She opened her mouth and closed it. Her eyes were doing something complicated that I didn't have a word for. Leanne was looking at the tablecloth. My father was looking at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on him before. Not shock, exactly. More like recognition, like he was seeing something he'd looked past so many times that he'd forgotten to look at all. My aunt, bless her, raised her glass in my direction and said, "Well, to Phoebe." A few people repeated it, not everyone, but enough. I picked my glass back up and drank. What I didn't expect. And I want to be honest here, because there's a version of this story where I walk out triumphant and tidy and everything is resolved. What I didn't expect was how long the silence lasted before anyone spoke again. It felt like minutes. It was probably 15 seconds. But in that 15 seconds, something true and unignorable sat in the middle of that table, and every single person in that room had to decide what to do with it. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. My mother didn't cry. Leanne didn't apologize. My father didn't give a speech. The dinner finished. People helped clear the table. My aunt put on music. There were conversations in smaller groups, the way there always are at the end of these things. But my mother found me in the kitchen, alone, about 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway and looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you paid off your loans." "I know," I said. She said, "I didn't know any of that." I said, "I know that too." She looked like she wanted to say more and couldn't find it, and I understood that about her. She's always been better at warmth than at words when it actually costs her something. She reached out and put her hand on my arm and squeezed it once. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a reckoning. It wasn't the acknowledgement I'd waited for since I was 9 years old, holding a third-place ribbon. But it was something. It was her, at least, beginning to understand that there had been something to miss. I drove back to Chicago that night. It was still raining. I had a long client call the next morning and a contract to review and a team meeting in the afternoon, and somewhere in the middle of the Kennedy Expressway I started crying, in the way you cry when you've been holding something for so long you've stopped noticing the weight. And then suddenly it's lighter, and the lightness itself is the surprise. I didn't cry because I was sad. I cried because I had finally stopped waiting. That's the part I want you to hear if you're someone who has spent years in a family where someone else was the story and you were the background, not the moment at the table, not the sentence I said or the silence that followed it. The part in the car on the expressway, crying in the rain because I was finally, genuinely done waiting for someone else to see me. I had seen myself. That was enough. It turned out it had always been enough. I just needed to say it out loud in a room full of people on a Tuesday night in Evanston to understand that the only person whose version of me had ever really mattered was my own. The thing about being overlooked for a long time is that you start to mistake the silence for peace. I didn't realize how much I'd been carrying until I set it down. For years I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need the acknowledgement, that I was above needing it, that people who needed that kind of thing were fragile in a way I wasn't. I believed that. I really did. Until I was sitting at my mother's birthday table with a glass in my hand and no sentence to go with my name, and I understood that I hadn't risen above the need. I just learned to bury it somewhere I didn't have to look at every day. What I did that night wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. I didn't stand up to humiliate anyone or win anything. I stood up because I had finally understood something that took me 31 years to learn. That waiting for someone else to say the true thing about you is a form of giving them power over a story that was never theirs to tell. My mother didn't introduce me as nothing because she hated me. She introduced me as nothing because she had never had to look. I'd made it easy for her by staying quiet, by being grateful for the scraps, by telling myself that needing less was the same thing as being stronger. It wasn't. Needing less was just a way of protecting myself from the disappointment of asking for more. What I've come to understand, slowly, imperfectly, still, is that there are 3 things that actually determine how your life turns out, and none of them have anything to do with who your parents chose to celebrate. The first is character, not performance, not image, the actual choices you make when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. Every time I paid a bill on time, delivered a project I was proud of, told a client the truth instead of what they wanted to hear, that was building something real. Character compounds the same way interest does. You don't feel it day to day. Then one day you look up and the person you've become is someone you can actually respect. The second is judgment, the ability to look clearly at a situation, including a painful one, and understand it for what it is, rather than what you wish it were. My mother wasn't a villain. My sister wasn't purely calculating. They were people operating inside a family dynamic that had been set long before I was old enough to question it. Understanding that didn't excuse what happened, but it kept me from making decisions out of bitterness that I would have had to live with later. Clarity is not the same as forgiveness, but it's a prerequisite for it. The third is persistence, not loudness, not aggression, just the quiet refusal to stop. I built my business in the gaps between what people expected of me. Nobody handed me the first client or the second or the third. Nobody called to check if I was okay during the months I was eating soup and questioning everything. I kept going because the work was mine in a way nothing else in my life had ever been, and I wasn't willing to let go of the one thing I'd made entirely by myself. When I told that table who I wasn't asking my mother to finally see me. I had already seen myself. That's what I wish I could tell the version of me holding a third-place ribbon at 9 years old, standing in the kitchen waiting for her mother to finish a phone call. You don't have to wait for someone to recognize you. You can just decide to know what you're worth, do the work that proves it to yourself, and let the rest follow in whatever order it comes. The table went silent that night because the truth is disarming. It doesn't need volume, it just needs to be said.